Chapter 3, The New Scientific Revolution, the Magnetic Connection. Long distance cell to cell or organism to organism, communications may be accomplished by transmission and reception of electromagnetic signals through membrane receptors or enzymes. Tang Song, MD, Deciphering the Language of Cells and Trends in Biological Science. Over the past decade, important discoveries have been made indicating that living things sense and derive information from the natural magnetic field of the Earth. While I had postulated this in early 1960s and had theorized that the mechanism involved was the interaction of the geomagnetic field with the system of internal DC currents, I was only half right. The mechanism of interaction are much more complex and sophisticated and involve actual anatomical structures designed for this purpose. Magnetic fields and biology. When I made my discoveries in the early 1960s, physics had shown that any flowing electrical current produced a magnetic field in the space around it, and that a changing, pulsing, or moving magnetic field could produce an electrical current flow, an electrical conductor placed within the field. In its simplest form, a magnetic field is a field of magnetic force extending out from a permanent magnet. Everyone is familiar with the illustrations of the lines of magnetic force around a bar magnet. Magnetic fields are produced by moving electrical currents, and the field of the bar magnet is produced by the spinning of the electrons around the atomic nuclei and the iron material of the bar magnet itself. In order to act as a magnet, these atoms must be lined up in the same direction so that the individual magnetic fields combine to produce one big field. If a magnet is dropped on the hard floor, the magnetic field is destroyed because the atoms are shaken up and their direction is changed, resulting in a random pattern. When electrical current flows in a wire, the movement of the electrons produces a similar field in space, but one that is oriented around the wire. If the current is a DC current, the magnetic field is steady, like that from a permanent magnet. The strength of the magnetic field depends upon the amount of current flowing in the wire. The more current there is, the stronger the magnetic field will be. Very large DC current electromagnets are used to pick up heavy metal objects. All magnetic fields have a direction or vector. We know that the bar magnet has a north pole and a south pole. These names coined long ago reflect the fact that unlike poles attract each other, while like poles repel each other. The pole of the bar magnet that pointed to Earth's north pole was called the North Pole. Obviously, the terms north and south have no special meaning except to indicate that the magnetic field has direction as well as strength. If the electrical current in the wire is fluctuating, the magnetic field will have the same fluctuations. We characterize the field in this case on the basis of the rate or frequency of fluctuation. For example, once per second, 1,000 times per second, etc. In science, we use the term hertz rather than per second. After Heinrich Hertz, who first studied this phenomenon, once per second thus becomes a field of 1 hertz frequency and so forth. Now we come to a difficulty. The field fluctuating in this fashion theoretically extends out in space to end of the universe, but decreasing in strength with distance and ultimately becoming lost in the welter of other magnetic fields that fill space. It is called an electromagnetic field because it contains both an electric field and a magnetic field. Since it is fluctuating at a certain frequency, it also has a wave of motion. The speed with which it moves outward is the same as that of light, roughly 186,000 miles per second. As a result, it has a wavelength which depends upon the frequency. For example, a 1 hertz frequency has a wavelength in millions of miles. A 1 million hertz frequency, shortened to 1 megahertz or 1 megahertz, has a wavelength of several hundred feet, and a 100 million hertz frequency has a wavelength of about 6 feet. All of the possible frequencies of electromagnetic waves or fields can be put onto an electromagnetic spectrum, starting with the slowest frequencies and going to the highest. The electromagnetic spectrum is usually pictured as a line that increases from 0 on the left to trillions of cycles per second on the right. About 3/4 of up the frequency spectrum is something we are very familiar with, light. Sunlight, as well as the light from the electric lights, is the same thing as the magnetic field. It is produced by the movement of electrons and has the same characteristics as the Earth's magnetic field, radio waves, and X-rays. It is an electromagnetic field, but one for which we have developed specific anatomical detectors, our eyes. All electromagnetic fields are force fields, carrying energy and capable of producing an action at a distance. It would appear that we know everything about electromagnetic fields, but we don't. One of the big problems of physics is the fact that these fields have characteristics of both waves and particles. Depending on how you look at light, radio waves, or any other part of the electromagnetic spectrum, you will find either waves or particles called photons. The photon is a very strange thing. It is a particle, a little piece of something, but it has no mass. No one has ever seen one. In quantum theory, photons carry the energy. Those with higher frequencies have more energy than those with lower frequencies. And the human eye, one photon gives up its energy to the retina, which somehow converts it into electrical signal that produces the sensation of light. And some magnetic and electromagnetic fields have energy, can carry information, and are produced by electrical currents. When we talk about electrical currents and flowing in living organisms, we also imply that they are producing magnetic fields that extend outside of the body and can be influenced by external magnetic fields as well. In the early 1960s, I predicted that the flow of this DC current in the brain would produce a magnetic field that could be observed at a distance outside of the head if one had a magnetometer of sufficient sensitivity. When I made this statement at a scientific meeting, there was considerable laughter from the audience. I was told that such a device would never be made, and that if such a magnetic field could be measured, its strength would be so small that it would be of no physiological consequence whatsoever. It was not until several discoveries were made in a solid state physics and electronics, culminating in the design of SQUID, superconducting quantum interference detector, magnometer in 1970, that I was proved correct. Today, the magnetic field called the magnetoencephalogram, or MEG, produced by the brain is easily detected using the SQUID magnometer, a device based upon the fact that a superconducting current that a superconducting current is extremely sensitive to very small magnetic fields. The flow of the electrical currents in the brain actually does produce a magnetic field that can be measured and analyzed several feet away from the head. It was gratifying to read that a study with the MEG had shown a vector of DC running between the front and back of the brain, exactly as I had discovered many years before by measuring DC potentials alone. It may be a little disconcerting to know that we and all other living things are surrounded by a magnetic field extending out into space from our bodies, and that the fields from the brain reflect what is happening in the brain. The implications of this are enormous, and I will discuss some of them later on. In the 1960s, I predicted that living organisms could be influenced by external electromagnetic fields via the physical interaction of the fields and the DC electrical currents flowing within the organisms. While this was theoretically true, the very small strength of the currents would require a magnetic field strength considerably greater than that of the Earth in order to have any material effect upon the organisms. Therefore, the idea that living things could be influenced by changes in the Earth's low strength geomagnetic field remained an old wives' tale. However, some biologists obtained excellent evidence of a direct important relationship between the Earth's magnetic field and the cyclic behavior of living organisms. Linking biological cycles to the Earth's magnetic field. By the 1960s, the phenomenon of biological cycles had been known for some time and had attracted increasing interest and experimentation because it appeared to have some mysterious relationship to certain clinical conditions. For example, many psychological and psychiatric disturbances were characterized by disturbances in the sleep wakefulness cycle. It was known that living things, including humans, had an intrinsic cycle in sleep wakefulness activities that occurred even when environmental cues such as daylight and temperature were excluded. The mechanists explained this by simply postulating that a chemical oscillator or clock timer for the cycles existed somewhere in the brain. This idea neglected one important fact of all the cycles had rates of change that were very practically identical to similar cycles in our geophysical environment. The biological cycles were similar not only to the light cycles of day and night, but also to the daily tidal changes in Earth's magnetic field and to the lunar cycle of 28 days, which was well represented in the pattern of female menstruation. Long range patterns of change in human affairs had been shown to have some relationship to the 22-year cycle of solar magnetic field activity, and some disturbances in human behavior had appeared to be related to magnetic storms in Earth's geomagnetic field. To the mechanist, these links were simply happenstance because there was no physical mechanism by which any physical field other than light could influence the actions of living organisms. Nevertheless, this tantalizing relationship led a number of scientists to think the unthinkable. Perhaps living organisms detected and derived timing information from the cyclic pattern in the Earth's magnetic field. Among the scientists intrigued with this possibility was Professor Frank Brown of the Woods Hole Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Brown completed research that established beyond any doubt that the cycles of a number of simple organisms could be changed in dramatic fashion simply by exposing them to a magnetic field from a small permanent magnet of the same strength of the Earth's field, but pointing in a different direction. The strength of the Earth's magnetic field averages about half a Gauss, and worse yet, its daily change in strength is less than zero point 0.1 Gauss compared with the 200 Gauss strength of the permanent magnet that holds a refrigerator door closed. This is peanuts indeed. There's simply no way that such a small change in the field could influence even a compass needle. However, Brown's experiments indicated clearly that living organisms had ability to somehow sense these minute daily cycles in Earth's magnetic field and to use them to time their biological cycles. The notion that living things could be influenced by such a weak field was akin to Mesmer's claims, and despite the validity of Brown's experiments and the importance of this data, his findings were simply ignored. Magnetic sense organs in living things. Today, 20 years after Professor Brown's experiments, we know that living things have the capability of detecting and obtaining information from such low strength fields as the steady geomagnetic field and its cyclic fluctuations. They accomplish this by means of two specific anatomical structures that are connected with the brain. Brown was right. The magnetic organ. In 1975, Professor Richard Blakemore, also of the Woods Hole Marine Biological Laboratory, became intrigued by the strange behavior of some bacteria he was studying. Blakemore noticed that the bacteria always clustered at the north side of their culture dish, even if he turned the dish so that they were at the south end and left it overnight. The next morning, the bacteria were back at the north side. While such magnetotrophic bacteria had been described before, no one had ever done what Blakemore did next. He looked at them under the electron microscope. What he found was astonishing. Each bacterium contained a chain of tiny magnets. The magnets were actually crystals of the natural magnetic mineral magnetite, the original lodestone of preliterate peoples. Somehow the bacteria absorbed the soluble components from the water and put them in their bodies as the insoluble crystalline chain. Later studies showed that this arrangement was of value to these bacteria. which lived in the mud on the bottom of shallow bays and marshes. If they were moved by the tide or by the storm waves, their magnetic chains were large enough in comparison to their body size to physically turn their bodies so that they pointed down at an angle corresponding to the direction of magnetic north. All the bacteria had to do was swim in that direction, and sooner or later they would be back in the mud. This was an interesting mechanism, but it did not contain any sophisticated information transfer. The bacteria did not know that north was the way to swim. They just did so. However, these observations opened up a much more interesting series of investigations. Some higher organisms demonstrate amazing abilities of migration and direction finding of these. The homing pigeon has been the most studied, while various attempts had been made to show that these pigeons somehow used a magnetic compass. All had come to naught. Then in 1971, Dr. William Keaton of Cornell University reported on a lengthy series of experiments. Keaton conceived that the idea that, like commercial airliners, pigeons had more than one national system. He proposed that the one used most often was polarized light from the sun, which would give the birds a sort of steady compass direction. This would be used in conjunction with a map sense. I remembered visual representation of the ground with recognizable landmarks. Pilots would call this visual flight cues, or VFR. Keaton postulated that the birds had also had a third standby system, one that would be used only in absence of the first two, such in a dense fog. This was the magnetic sense. In a stroke of genius, Keaton found a way to cancel out the first two systems without harming the pigeons or interfering with the experiment. He fitted them with translucent contact lenses. The lenses permitted light to enter, but they prevented the entry of polarized light or any of the visual images. If the pigeons could still find their way home, Keaton reasoned that it must be with the help of magnetic sensing system. He released his pigeons in the Adirondack Mountains of New York State, about 100 miles from the Cornell in the straight line distance. The pigeons with the contact lenses came home just as well as the pigeons without lenses, except they made a detour. Instead of flying in a straight line to Cornell, they first flew west out over Lake Ontario. Pigeons never fly over large bodies of open water, but these pigeons could not, of course, see the lake. At a certain point, they turned south and went straight to Cornell, arriving somewhat later than the others. Keene wondered if they had perhaps flown west until they crossed a line of the Earth's magnetic field that intersected with Cornell. Keene's next experiment was clinchier. To the back of the head, each pigeon with contact lenses, he glued a small magnet of about 1/2 Gauss strength, roughly equally to the local geomagnetic field, but oriented opposite to it in direction. When released, these birds scattered, flying in all directions and not returning to Cornell until the contacts fell off about a day or two later. These birds had a magnetic sense that was canceled out by a small abnormal magnetic field applied to the brain. So there was no question. Pigeons had several navigation systems, and one of them was an ability to sense and derive directional information from the Earth's magnetic field. After a humble bacterium had been shown to have a magnet within it and the homing pigeon to have a magnet compass, might it also be possible that homing pigeons have a magnet within their bodies? This question occurred to Dr. Charles Walcott of the State University of New York at Stony Brook. In order to answer it, he had to use two of the newest instruments available, the squid mentioned earlier and the electron microscope. Since the magnetic crystals were extremely tiny and he could be seen only under the electron microscope, one first had to know where to look for them. To determine where to look with the electron microscope, Walcott used the ability of the squid to sense the minute magnetic field given off by the crystals. This was a difficult and time-consuming process, but he succeeded. He found the same crystals of magnetite as a submicroscopic mass located on the surface of the pigeon's brain. Walcott reasoned that the same simple mechanism used by bacteria could not possibly work for the pigeon. The mass of crystals was far too small to exert any push or pull on the pigeon, and some sort of information transfer system from the magnetite crystals to the brain had to be involved. He found that the mass of crystals was full of nerve fibers that seemed to go into the brain. However, he did not know, and we still don't know today exactly where those fibers go inside the brain. At any rate, it appears quite certain that the magnetite crystals tell the pigeon's brain the exact direction of the Earth's magnetic field, and that the pigeon uses the information to navigate with its amazing precision. Since Walcott's work, many other scientists have continued this investigation. As a result, we now have detailed information on the exquisite sensitivity of this system. It is far more sensitive than our very best magnetic compass, and we know that it is present in almost all types of living organisms, probably excluding the human being. Dr. Robin Baker at the University of Manchester, England, has tentatively located our magnetic organ in the posterior wall of the ethmoid sinus, located high up at the back of the nasal passage, just in front of the pituitary gland. In several controversial experiments, Baker has shown that humans have an innate ability to sense the direction of magnetic north, and that this ability can be blocked by placing a bar magnet across against a person's forehead for only 15 minutes. Baker also claims that a subject's directional sense is disturbed for as long as 2 hours after application of the magnet. Perhaps the strong field of the bar magnet disturbs the normal orientation of the magnetite crystals, resulting in a loss of directional sensing ability until they return their normal orientation. If Baker's experiments can be confirmed and the evidence obtained for deposits of magnetite in the ethmoid sinus, it is probable that similar nerve pathways extend from them to the brain, as they have been found in other animals. My favorite animal, the salamander, has two separate magnetic navigational systems. One provides a simple compass so that when the salamander is traveling cross country, it will go in a straight line. This is important because it cannot go far without water. The other system enables it to return to the exact spot where it was hatched from its egg in order to mate and lay more eggs. The magnetite containing magnetic organ that is probably present in most life forms, including humans, is closely connected to the brain. It has been shown unequivocally to sense organ that informs the organisms of the direction of the Earth's magnetic field, that it is possible that it also is sensitive to and reports information on the micropulsation frequencies, although this aspect has not been studied, as if to emphasize the importance of the relationship between the geomagnetic field and living organisms. Nature has provided us with yet another organ that also senses the field and that extracts even more significant information from it. The pineal gland's magnetic sense. As mentioned earlier in this book, the pineal gland is a tiny pinecone shaped structure in the exact geometric center of the head, as you'll recall from the earlier discussion. Descartes believed that this gland was the seat of the soul. While this is undoubtedly incorrect, the pineal gland has gone from the status of an insignificant curiosity to being considered as the master gland of the body. The pineal has an interesting history. It is the remnant of the third eye, which was located on the top of the head in many primitive vertebrates. In this position, it is probably did not register images, but was responsible for measuring the intensity of natural light so that an animal could alter its coloration to better match its surroundings. While a few primitive animals, notably the lamprey eel and the hagfish, still have a third eye that performs this function, in most life forms, the pineal slowly sank from the surface to the deep within the brain structure. It has only been during the past decade that scientists have discovered how important this structure is. The pineal produces a veritable pharmacopoeia of active chemical substances. Some regulate the operations of the other glands in the body, including the pituitary, the former master gland. Others are major neuromorphones such as melatonin, serotonin, and dopamine, which regulate the level of operations of the brain itself. The pineal is the clock that mechanists postulate was the source of biological cycles. The cyclic pattern of sleep wakefulness is dependent upon the level of melatonin secretion by the pineal. It was first determined that a part of the output of the retina was diverted to the pineal, where it was sensed as the day-night cycle, and melatonin secretion was adjusted accordingly. More recently, it has been shown that the pineal is also sensitive to the daily cyclic pattern in the Earth's magnetic field. Melatonin secretion in human subjects may be changed at will by exposure to steady magnetic fields of the same strength of the geomagnetic field. Apparently, nature determined that biological cycle activity was too important to be left to one environmental signal alone. At the present time, there is great interest in the psychiatric community about the probability that abnormal secretion of neurohormones by the pineal is linked to many behavioral abnormalities. Medicine in general has become aware of the fact that disturbances in the biocycle pattern are of considerable clinical importance. For example, the primary effect of chronically abnormal biocycle is the production of chronic stress syndrome, a condition that produces a wide variety of clinical problems, including a marked decline in competency of the immune system. Most recently, it has been shown that the time when cancer chemotherapeutic drugs are administered during a patient's biocycle is a major determiner of their effect. Given at the appropriate time, they are more effective against cancer cells and produce fewer side effects than if given at the wrong time. The National Cancer Institute considers this important enough that it will conduct an in-depth study of the phenomenon. Nature intended the pineal to simultaneously receive the same signals from the daily pattern of day-night and the same rise and fall in strength of the geomagnetic field. Obviously, when one or both signals are abnormal, the pineal does not respond in the normal fashion, and the body's biological cycles become disturbed with important clinical consequences. The total body effects of external fields are mediated through at least two highly specific and sophisticated internal organs. The magnetic organ, which is composed of minute crystals of magnetite and is closely connected to the central nervous system, and the pineal gland, which is a part of the brain. The presence of one or more of the other of these organs in species as diverse as bacteria, insects, fish, and amphibians and mammals indicates that they are vitally important to normal life functions, and that this mechanism originated very early in evolution. The only conclusion possible is that living organisms sense the Earth's geomagnetic field and derive vital information from it. Not very long ago, such a statement would have been viewed as rank hearsay by the scientific establishment. However, the fact that living things have this capability should not come as a surprise. Considering the nature of Earth's normal electromagnetic field, if we could use the concept of electromagnetic spectrum and arrange the various components of the normal electromagnetic environment with no man-made fields present on a linear scale of increasing frequency, we can visualize relationships. It appears that over 2 billion years of evolution, living things have taken advantage of the two portions of the electromagnetic spectrum that could be depended upon to always present the geomagnetic field and visible life. In this view, it was no more surprising that life developed specific organs to sense the geomagnetic field and to derive timing information from it than that it developed specific organs to sense and derive information from light. Research on the sensitivity of magnetic organ and the pineal has been done with DC magnetic fields, but the micropulsation frequencies have been neglected. If we expand that portion of the electromagnetic spectrum pictured in the figure 3.2 to show only the Earth's steady magnetic field and the very slowest frequencies, we find that the micropulsation frequencies have a peculiar spectrum of their own. The frequency spectrum of the micropulsations is practically identical with that of the EEG and MEG of all organisms that are sufficiently developed to have a brain. While there is no evidence for any sensing of micropulsation frequencies, it is interesting that the major component of this frequency spectrum, 10 Hertz, is also the major component of the EEG and MEG. In addition, it is the frequency most commonly used for electrosensing those aquatic organisms that use this mechanism to locate prey. As we shall see in later chapters, frequency may be more important parameter than field strength for biological effect. The dual nervous system completed. Over the past 25 years, the discoveries described above have produced a new vision of living things, one that has returned electromagnetic energy to a position of prominence, drawing upon the concepts of information theory and solid state physics, and aided by instruments of vastly improved sensitivity and sophistication. We have described electronic control systems within the body that regulate such functions as growth and healing, and that also serve as a substrate for our internal control and communication systems. Application of the same technology to relationship between the external energies in the Earth's geomagnetic field and living organisms has revealed that living things are infinitely related to this field and derive vital basic information from it. What has emerged in this basic outline of a dual nervous system, a primitive analog component that appeared early in evolution and more sophisticated digital nerve impulses, component of more recent origin. What I have described is the essence of the latest scientific revolution, which is providing us with a greatly expanded vision of the complexity and capabilities of living things. Those embarrassing little oddities that the chemical mechanistic theory could not explain are beginning to be understood by advocates of this new paradigm. On the surface, it might appear that we are bringing vitalism back into biology, but that would be a mistaken view. What we are doing is bringing energy back into the living system and assigning it the task of organizing and controlling the total organism and its important functions. Medicine has come full circle from the mysterious energies of the shaman healer to the scientific understanding of life energies of the body and their relationship to the energies of the environment. The scientific revolution has simultaneously enriched the concepts of technological medicine and support the idea of energy medicine. What is emerging in a new paradigm of life, energy, and medicine?